We all misbehave sometimes. Wanna change the world, indulge in some bad behavior. Hello and welcome to Bad Behavior, where we talk about women, activism and social change and our journey to becoming the best, baddest bitches that we can be. I am Rosalind and I am joined by our beautiful, wonderful editor, Namcheja.
Hey everyone, I'm filling in for Nicola because Nicola's in Europe enjoying herself and we are all happy for her.
Yeah, we're super duper happy and not at all bitter and sad.
I'm not looking at those Instagram stories of her in Paris angry at all.
We have ice cream and personal joy. Anyway, so today we have a really, really exciting episode because we have an interview for you. But before we do that, Cheji and I really wanted to talk about something that cropped up a lot over the last few months. We've had so many incredible movements going on. The Me Too movement, where people are calling people out on really terrible behavior they had a long time ago, but also behavior from now. So with the Me Too movement, with people being called out like Louis C.K. and various others, Harvey Weinstein, incredible. It needed to happen. But then you've got other people such as Jeffree Star on YouTube and a few others who are being called out for things that happened a long time ago. Those things were really terrible. But how do we differentiate between the two? How do we discuss those differences? Because I was reading a really interesting article about the flattening that happens with the internet. So we are so used to thinking of Twitter as this current thing that happens, that people throw out their thoughts and it's new and, you know, people should be accountable for those things. But it's 10 years old. You just assume that it happened quite recently because it's Twitter. And there's this kind of flattening thing that happens.
I think people are aware of it because they go and they dig up. That's a lot of time someone must spend to scroll.
But when they call it out, people who get angry about it, do they know? Do they check?
Twitter was not around when I was growing up, thank God, because I would have just said some stupid things just to say some stuff. And I can think about the person I was maybe like 15 years ago is definitely not the same person I am now. People do change and people do the work to change.
Yeah, I think everyone feels that in different ways. You know, you come to realizations throughout your life, and part of this podcast is us sort of recognizing that we're on a journey to being good feminists. We're not going to be brilliant, wonderful people who know everything about everything. It's just not possible. And I agree, you know, I want to live in a world where people can change. I want to live in a world of second chances where everybody has a chance to make their case and make it better and make it right. But it's hard because at the same time, I still have that feeling when things come up. I still get that feeling of, yes, like, call them out for that shit. Like, that's wrong, you know, and it is. So much of what comes up is horrible stuff that really does deserve to be pointed at, because this is where we get our definitions for what is acceptable, is for what society's calling people out on. Where is that line? And we need to draw that line. And that's really important to say these people that we love and admire have done terrible things. That's important to note. But how do we navigate that space when they're public figures? This might have happened 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and they're getting called out sort of at the same levels, and we don't have a very sophisticated way of having that conversation, because people like Roseanne.
Oh yes, Roseanne from the I don't know her full name, but you know, Roseanne from the Roseanne show.
Yeah, who got called out for her very racist tweet. They're important to call out and they should have swift consequences, and they kind of did, you know. Well, Roseanne certainly did. And that's important, and that sort of shows that we have drawn that line. But the Guardians of the Galaxy director or someone had got called out, and it was from a long time ago, and the people who were part of the show decided to support him and say that he had changed, but the network decided to take him off the project, which, if it had happened today, would have been a just and correct thing to do. Surely. But where is the line? Do you know what I mean? We can't have the same consequences, but at the same time, we still do need to call people out. We need to have this conversation. We need to find out a way of having these different demarcations of what's right and how do we punish people who have done bad things, but how do we allow for change? How do we allow people to genuinely apologize? Where is the line?
The genuine apology is also a whole other segment. I guess drawing the line in the sand about what is acceptable. It's basically the crowd. You're being judged by society or whoever's on, you know, social media at the time. And I think it's just one of those things that it's going to evolve over time. I think probably need to give someone the benefit of the doubt.
Like, I feel like, yes, we need to give people the benefit of the doubt in terms of, like, you've changed and apologized, but you need to do the work. You need to sit there and you need to apologize. I'm not giving you the benefit of the doubt unless you show me that you care enough about your reputation that you're doing so. I don't care if you don't, like, give a shit about whatever it is you said. You apologize. You know what I mean? Because we're drawing the line. You have to come and meet us with the moral standard of society and apologize. I'm saying that right now.
Not only do you need to apologize, you need to show that you have done the work. So one of my favorite comedians, Trevor Noah, before he came to do his show in Australia, he had made a joke in the past concerning Aboriginal women, and it was a shitty joke, and he got called out for it. And he addressed it, and then when he came to Australia, I know he sat down with people from the Aboriginal community to discuss what he had said, and that was his way of doing the work.
There were people who weren't happy with him still, though, because he didn't categorically apologize. He qualified it saying, you know, I had different context, I made a joke, but he never said, I'm very sorry for my joke. He said, I won't apologize for it because I'm a comedian. I make jokes and I'm going to offend people. But he did do the work in the terms of sitting down with the Aboriginal community, yes, but he didn't apologize. So there are still people who find that, like, he didn't do what he needed to do, which is to apologize for something that propagated really bad stereotypes about Aboriginal women who are a marginalized community, you know, and we should be taking their word for what is, you know, a really bad thing to say. But again, it's like, who has the right to decide what is genuine? Who has the right to decide what exact steps you have to do to apologize for something? And where is the line between what you do now if you've done something recently and what you do when it was 15 years ago? Like, how do you navigate that? There's no real clear way. Okay, this is what I've come to in the last 3 seconds when I thought about it. I think that the real answer to this is that we have to keep calling people out. Because people are saying, oh, we have to stop calling people out about things that happened a long time ago. No, I think that we need to call people out about all the things that can be construed as really racist and really misogynistic and all of those things. Because if we have a lot of people calling a lot of people out, naturally we're going to have to create those lines. But it's important to have these conversations, you know, like, because I think going from here, maybe you and I need to sit down and talk about what our definitions are and what we would actually classify it as. Like, genuinely, you know, and maybe, you know, if you're listening, sit down with someone and really talk about this stuff too, because if we really care about it, we're the ones who have to say something.
Yeah, I think my whole thing is, like, sometimes you just have to tweet or, you know, post on social media as if one day it's going to be read out in court. Like, read what you're going to post.
Be paranoid now.
Speaking as a person who's semi-paranoid.
Cheji is batshit insane paranoid.
Semi-paranoid. I do not have the foil on my head yet, mostly because my fro will not allow me to.
Here's the thing. If your post targets a person or a minority group or, you know, anything like that, if you can look at it and go, there's a target of this, and you're not fine with whoever that target is, you think about it before you press whatever it is you press. Okay, it's a minefield. It's a fucking minefield, okay? I don't tweet.
You retweet.
I retweet. Oh, that's another thing, the liking of the tweets. Because people have called out people for liking tweets.
One time I liked this person's tweet, and then I went back and I was like, let me take a look at this person's previous posts. I went and unliked that tweet quickly because they were saying some crazy shit.
You could be someone in the near future could look through your Twitter and go, you liked this tweet. Now I feel like you need to apologize to our listeners. Anyway, we really need to wrap this up. We have a really amazing special guest, which we're going to play for you right now. Today we're talking to Anna Brownfield, a multi-award-winning feminist erotic filmmaker. Her work is screened at numerous festivals here in Australia and overseas, including the International Women's Conference in Beijing and the WOW Film Festival in Sydney. She makes feminist porn and erotic films. She also makes films that capture historical narratives, such as The Bedroom, which follows the development of Australian sexual culture in the 50s, and it also makes documentaries about sex, the industry, and crafts.
So a very accomplished lady. Okay, so I've got our sneaky question to ask you first. How have you been bad this week?
Have I been bad? That's a really tricky question. Oh, I don't know. I think being a working mother and trying to balance all of that, you always feel a bit bad that you've not given your child enough time during the week. So I suppose that, and also the other thing, I suppose I've been bad because I've been in pre-production for my next erotic film.
So I thought I would start off right at the beginning and ask you what inspired you to become a filmmaker.
Oh, I suppose I grew up actually doing musicals and wanted to be an actress actually. And my mother sort of sat me down and said, look, Anna, only 5% of actors make a full-time living in Australia. You need to think about having some other skills as well. So I was like, okay. And so I actually was interested in photography and sort of dabbled in it just sort of in my own spare time in year 12 because I was lucky enough at my school we had, it's back in the day of, developing things and using chemicals. So there was actually a darkroom at school. So I did a lot of that on my own sort of accord during year 12, and then so I actually ended up studying when I finished that I came down to Melbourne and did like a T12 in photography, and in that I did an elective in filmmaking, and that's when I sort of started going, hang on, although I love photography, I think my ideas work much better as moving images. So it sort of developed from there really, and I thought, oh yeah, I could give this a go. When I was growing up, my parents really encouraged us to be creative. I mean, we didn't watch a lot of TV growing up. We were limited to half an hour a day. It had to be ABC. So we sort of had a lot of time to do things. And I mean, this is obviously pre-computers and internet, so we couldn't get lost in the void that is that. Yeah, and we always had a cupboard in the kitchen that was full of I mean, nowadays people would be horrified, but things like old toilet rolls, cardboard, paper, textures, pens, glue, sticky tape. So we were always encouraged to make things, and it wasn't like, we have to keep the house clean. We're encouraged to make mess. My brother used to build dioramas and is really quite an amazing drawer and things. So it was like there was always that element growing up that we were encouraged to be creative and explore our creativity.
Wow, that's so interesting because I wasn't allowed to watch TV when I was young. My mother bought a big block of clay, and then we would sort of go in with the clay and throw it everywhere and make probably terrible art. But I find that really interesting because a lot of the time when I say that, people are like, you didn't grow up with television. And a lot of pop culture references just go right over my head as well.
Exactly. And I remember, this is back in the day where, there was Sunday night was the big movie, blockbuster movie on TV, and I'd come in the next day and all the kids would be talking about this, or they'd be talking about like the TV series that were really popular around the 70s were Prisoner, and they'd come in talking about the latest episode of this or that, and I'd just be going, oh, I've got no idea.
What does being a feminist erotic filmmaker actually entail?
Okay, I suppose the term I was thinking about this the other day, the term feminist erotic filmmaker, I suppose it sort of first came into play when I was at uni and I was making, most of my films were looking at female sexuality, its representation on screen. And I remember, I'd shown a couple of films, I was talking to someone who worked at RMIT and she actually came up with the term, she goes, I'd call your work feminist erotica. And I was like, oh, okay, that's quite good. Yeah, that does kind of sum me up. So I suppose it sort of just went from there. So, initially it was just about looking at and kind of questioning, how women's sexuality does work on screen and how very much, it's from often a male point of view and it's more about progressing the male story and not necessarily the female story or her sexual adventures sort of thing. So it sort of started from there, and then as time went on, I sort of went, oh, well, I wouldn't mind making something actually explicit as well, so that focus more on, I suppose, female sexual desires and seeing it from a female perspective rather than a lot of the stuff that was out there at the time and, still is very much from a male point of view and has a particular aesthetic in terms of how it's shot and how sex is presented on screen.
So is there a difference between erotic film and pornography, or is it just sort of a term?
I often interchange it, I suppose, just because, and it took me a while to sort of feel comfortable calling myself a pornographer, and it depends on who I talk to, depends on whether I use that term. I think because the word pornography, people assume they have this sort of aesthetic and idea of what a pornographic film should look like, and I suppose my films don't fit into that formula, so unless they're sort of quite enlightened people, I don't tend to use that word, or I have to spend a fair amount of time explaining, well, this is actually what I do, so and how I suppose it's different. Whereas a lot of people go, well, it's not really erotica because it's explicit, and I go, what? Yes, but the way I shoot it, so I don't know. It's sort of like that constant thing of like, well, am I not? Am I not?
That's a discussion we really need to have, I guess, because terms are so important and how we view it is so important. You're right, pornography can be very like the to-do list of things that happen in this film. And
I think it can also be a class thing. I mean, a lot of people think of pornography as being very low class sort of thing, whereas erotica kind of has that more association with art, so people kind of think, oh, it's more worthy and so forth. So I think it's sort of, it's trying to make a balance between that. Like, I was quite surprised there's another ethical filmmaker or feminist erotic filmmaker in Australia called Gala Bunting, and I consider them art films. Like, they're beautiful. But she likes to term them as pornography because she wants to take sort of that idea of it doesn't have to have this highbrow connotation, that it can still be a beautiful and artistic piece, but within this genre. So, it's all, I suppose nowadays it becomes more and more open to interpretation.
So what inspires you to create the works that you make?
Different things. I mean, it's kind of weird. A lot of the time it may just be one little idea or one sort of, I might see something in my head and kind of think, oh, that'd be really good. Like, the latest film I'm making is a film noir from the femme fatale's perspective. And I think it just came out of, I love, that high glamour and, the contrasting lighting. And I was thinking, I'd love to make something in that style. But then I thought, well, what can I do that will make it different to, say, just a normal film noir? And I thought, well, so much of film noir is about, from the male's perspective, it's about, fetishizing the femme fatale. And I thought, well, what if you turned that around on its head and made the film from her perspective instead? So, sometimes a lot of the time it's just playing with a genre. I mean, The Bedroom, which was my last feature-length film, erotic film I made, the idea for that actually came out of one of my friends. Her father had passed away and she had to put her mother into care, and they had this awesome house, and she sort of said, oh, it'd be great to make a porno in here. And I was like, yeah, it would, because it just has the most amazing wallpaper and it's pretty much sort of late 60s in original condition. So yeah, I started to think about the idea of like making a film, and then I sort of thought, oh, well, what about setting it one bedroom over 6 decades? And I sort of thought, well, what can I do in that? What would be interesting? Then I thought, well, how about looking at exploring the changes to sex and sexuality over the decades in Australia? So we started in the 1960s and then sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and then to 2010. So, sometimes it comes from very random things. I mean, the band came from, I used to work as a door bitch at the Tote Hotel, and I started hearing stories from sort of the rock and roll, indie rock and roll scene, and then I'd sort of start actually also asking band members or managers to, tell me the most filthy stories you've heard about people on tour or what bands have been up to, and then I just sort of took a lot of those stories and wrote them into a script.
You mentioned a little bit of it, but you've been in the industry for a while, so have you seen changes in the industry or changes in societal ideas?
Yeah, it's changed quite a lot. I think initially when I started making, there wasn't really anyone else there weren't other women in Australia making content. It was also sort of pre the internet, and not pre, the internet was around, but it was also pre video streaming. So in terms of if you wanted to distribute your films, it was DVD. There were also laws in terms of restrictions in terms of what you could and couldn't sell and where you could sell it in Australia. So most of the time you needed to go to, say, an American adult distributor, and then they would generally want at least 5 films before they'd sort of take you on, and then you had to be regularly producing sort of content. So yeah, it made it quite tricky, and also as there were a few companies in Australia at that stage, but not that many, and many of them weren't focused on women or queers or anything alternative. It was very much mainstream. And I think when I made my first film, the band, it wasn't until, it took ages to finish. I think it took about, we shot it in 2006. I don't think we finished it until 2000. I finished it until 2009, 2010. And that year I went to the Berlin Porn Film Festival, and that was amazing because that, for the first time, they had 40% of the films were actually made by women. So all of a sudden I met this amazing international community, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. I also discovered I was pregnant while I was away, so I came home and I sort of like bunkered down for a bit. But when I sort of came out of that, one of the things that was fascinating was, video streaming was more accessible, e-commerce had really taken off. So now there were all these independent makers within Australia, and majority of them were women making things. So all of a sudden I'd gone from being this sort of sole person to having this awesome community around me that, when we arranged, one of the women arranged a thing called Porno Camp, and we got together and networked and shared information and skills and things like this. So that was great. And all of a sudden, there was a community around us. So, that's, I think, one way that it's been awesome, that it meant that the internet sort of democratized the production of erotica or pornography, and also enabled a lot of people to be able to, shoot it themselves, just distribute it themselves. And then I suppose now we've kind of gone to the next level of where, we're so flooded with tube sites that this is becoming becoming problematic for a lot of people, particularly a lot of independent producers, because, tube sites have basically grown from pirated content. And also, one of the main problems I have with them is also that they allow children to access pornography, whereas prior to that, if you wanted to access, you had to join up in some way, shape or form, so you had to provide something that proved you were 18. So this I have a huge problem with, and also I think it's just sort of saturated the market, and also people just assume pornography should be free. And the reality is, if you're an independent maker who's making a niche product that's something different from the mainstream, you kind of rely on people buying your product to be able to pay your performers well and your crew well, and also continue making content. So yeah, it's interesting how it's sort of done this big circle. The other thing is also MindGeek, who own the majority of tube sites, are quite they're an interesting company. Yeah, there's a lot of allegations. The original founder of it got done for money laundering and things. So there's also sort of weird things about. And I sort of wonder, where they're coming from and why they're choosing to do this as well.
Yeah, your films are screened all over the world. So do you get different reactions in different countries?
Yeah, I think it is quite different. Obviously, I don't actually get to screen my films a lot here in Australia just because the laws and because the opportunities here. I found the first time I went to Berlin Porn Film Festival when the band opened there, I didn't know quite what to expect. I sort of, you have this assumption that it'll be men in raincoats sitting in the cinema. And I was quite surprised, the age range, there were people from 18 to 70, and there was a diverse range of people. And I thought it was really awesome to be able to sit in a cinema and watch sexually explicit content with other people. And that was really amazing. And I think just, their general attitude towards sex and sexuality is probably a little bit different to ours. So, I think Australians are fairly open. But yeah, it was just nice to be able to, it was just seen as very much, oh yes, this is just what we do and you can do this. And, to go from when I first went, it was quite a small film festival. And then when I went 7 years later with The Bedroom, it was huge. It was massive. I was struggling to be able to get tickets to go to sessions and things. It had just exploded. And I thought, that's really quite amazing to be able to have something like that that's grown so much within that short period of time.
You mentioned the political climate in Australia making it difficult to make work. What are the laws around?
Okay, so in Australia, you can only actually legally shoot X-rated content within the ACT.
Really? Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And most people don't. And also, it's actually illegal to sell X-rated content outside of the ACT as well. So, back in the days of DVDs and VHS, if you went into an adult store and saw that and purchased that, actually it was illegal. But the thing is, I think because those environments are set up that no one can really access them unless they're 18, the police generally either A, don't know, or B, turn a blind eye to it unless someone makes a complaint. You're not meant to legally screen explicit material in a public space. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess because I've just grown up in a world where it's just so readily available that you don't really think about where it comes from.
Yeah. Well, also one of the big changes that happened is that in Australia they actually, I'm trying to think when this was, I think it was early 2000s, they actually made it, you couldn't actually host adult content on an Australian server, which is still the case now. So, you actually have to host it to a server overseas. A lot of people got upset about it because it was, it was making Australia a lot of money at that time.
I also wanted to ask if you've had ideas about erotic films and pornography that have been challenged throughout making the work that you make.
Yeah, I think initially, when I made the first one, the band, it did... we had some issues with casting. We had people pulling out at the last minute and having to cast things like that, which is fine. I don't have an issue with it. My attitude towards casting is making sure that people are informed and they're making an informed choice and thinking about not only what that means now, but also what it might mean to them in the future and, any careers they might want to pursue and things like that. I want them to think about, things like, often I ask people when they come to audition is, have you thought about, how you would feel if your family found out about this or your work colleagues found out about this and so forth. So just to make sure that people have really thought it through. And, this particular woman, obviously she'd said yes, and then I think she'd sort of stopped and thought about it and kind of gone, some of the ramifications down the line in terms of my career or what I want to do might impact on that. So she decided to pull out, which I was like, that's fine. I would rather you be there because you want to be there and you're comfortable be there rather than feeling like you're being forced into a situation or coerced into a situation. So during that time when we had to recast, it did make me stop and think, it's like, well, would I do this myself? myself? Do I feel comfortable asking these people to do this? And so that really challenged me quite a lot. And then I thought, well, I suppose that's something that most directors, I mean, you ask an actor to cry on screen, and you ask to exploit that part of their experience and things like that. So, is it any different? And I mean, I suppose the thing for me, I just came to the point that I'm just like, if I was more of an exhibitionist, I probably would jump in front of the camera, but unfortunately I'm not. And so, yeah, there's things like that challenge. I suppose, one of the things I like to give my performers a lot of agency and a lot of say in what they're doing. So, and how that impact them. So sometimes, that, but sometimes also like with something like, the bedroom, there was certain, because of the era in terms of sexual education and what people were aware of, there were sort of things like I go, okay, we can't do any of this because that wasn't really a common thing within people's sexual vernaculars at that time. And so, talking to them about, well, this is how, it needs to be a scene that's loving and gentle sort of thing, whereas, they might just say, oh, I really want to do rough sex. And it's like, well, it has to be part of this era. So, unfortunately that's compromises. So things like that I find challenging sometimes.
You spoke a little bit about how important female sexuality and representation is to you, and you're very careful to include strong female characters in your films. Why isn't it so important to bring the female gaze to porn?
Well, I think so much of it is from a male perspective, and we do see the objectification of women's bodies, and I mean particularly if you look at something like POV, which is very much from a male, like a male performer in the scene viewpoint, whereas you don't really see that. And I suppose, I think as women, what do we look at when we look at male bodies or female bodies or trans bodies? Like, what do we see and what do we find attractive? And I mean, things like, I used to be obsessed with the way, a man's hip sort of, connected to his leg or something. It's a different way of looking at things. I suppose one thing that I really want to emphasize was the sensuality element of it, whereas I found, a lot of mainstream or corporate porn is very much what I call porn by numbers. It's designed, to get certain types of camera angles and, get penetration shots and things. And my sort of thing was like, well, having a hand running up an arm feels really lovely. So why not, and really sensual. So why not show those sorts of things as well? So yeah, and I think, it's important to see things from other perspectives, that, we've sort of been trained that porn is this one viewpoint, it's this one way of shooting, it's this one way of representing sexual acts. And I suppose I want to kind of go, no, actually, let's show something different. Let's show something else. Let's change the visual language of this genre.
And I guess that ties into diversity of body types and sexualities and all of that, which is so important to represent, because you put yourself in that film, and like you do with any kind of film, and it's sort of seen as taboo, but it's just as important to represent different ways. I was talking to a friend recently who was really struggling because she found that the porn that was made seemed to be different races doing different things. She's Malaysian, so she was saying, if you want to watch an Asian woman in porn, a lot of the time they're innocent and they're, and she found it really frustrating when she was watching porn. So
and I think that's one of the things with, mainstream or corporate porn. A lot of the time it's about perpetuating stereotypes. And it's also the way things are often marketed. Like, they often tend to be quite sexist and quite racist as well. And I suppose that's one thing I really love about, the feminist and ethical porn movement, was that the fact that they took all of that out of there. So I remember talking to Courtney Trouble, who has Trouble Films, and she makes very, very, very diverse queer content. And, when she had trans people in it, a lot of the time it's promoted in the mainstream industry as, oh, she males, gets banged or whatever, but she took all of that out of it and made it sort of fun, made it sexy, and and I think that's the thing I really like, that it's not sort of relying on those stereotypical ideas of what either a gender or a sexuality or a race is. It's about this person being who they are, and I suppose having an element of authenticity about their performance and what they're doing and how they're doing it on screen.
Could you tell me a bit about the feminist movement within...
I suppose the person who really started it was probably Candida Royale back in the mid-80s. She founded she was a porn performer in the 70s, background in theatre and performance art. And she started her own company, Femme Productions, because this is around when VHSs became very common in people's homes. And she said, well, this enables people to be able to watch pornography at home, whereas previously to go out to a cinema. So she sort of went, well, now I can watch it at home and as a woman, but there's nothing that's made for my sort of sexual taste. So she was sort of the first person who started this. And, there were various other people who came into it, but I suppose it wasn't really until the internet that it kind of really blossomed. And I think one is the ethical treatment of performers, giving them agency in their performance. Also, so I think it's about the treatment of people, but it's also about celebrating a diversity. And a lot of the time it's about creating something more authentic that is to that person's own sexual interests, rather than it being sort of this this performative ideal. So a lot of the time you'll find there won't necessarily be massive penetration shots. You know, it's more about capturing someone actually enjoying themselves and really getting into it, and it not being such a performance-based sort of experience that you may see in mainstream.
How do you feel about mainstream pornography now that you've gone through that whole journey?
Look, I think there's some interesting people doing some interesting things within that industry. Australia's Angela White. I mean, although she's incredibly mainstream, but she's making some really interesting films within that have sort of feminist things. Like she just did one recently about fat shaming and men trying to control women and their bodies and what they eat within this genre of mainstream and she now lives and works in America. So I think that's quite fascinating. But look, in terms of the whole, I just think it hasn't really progressed, and other reasons I started making stuff as well was purely selfish, because I couldn't find anything that I wanted to see. So, and particularly around that time when I first sort of came up with the idea that I wanted to make stuff, the porn was really quite aggressive and really violent. Now looking at it and having an understanding of BDSM and stuff, some of it was consensual and there were safety things set up, and other stuff I saw there obviously wasn't, or maybe they edited it out, but it was really nasty towards women and it was quite aggressive and violent, and I just went, oh, I don't want to see that. I want to see something else. Sometimes, yeah, maybe I do want it a bit rough, but that's all there was at that stage. So yeah, to be honest, I don't actually look at a lot of mainstream pornography, and I don't really have a connection to it. I actually don't watch a lot of porn, and they're like, what? I'm like, I know, but a lot of the mainstream stuff just doesn't interest me. I mean, people like Emily Gervais, who's a French director, and Avidi, I think they were making some really interesting films. Shine Louise Houston, who's in the States, she makes these beautiful cinematic queer films that I remember the first time I saw one of hers, I was just like completely blown away. It was just like, oh my God, this woman is just amazing. So, and a lot of these have things that I like they have storylines, they look really cinematic, they look, they're nice, the performers are enjoying themselves and things. So yeah, so that sort of stuff appeals to me more if I do have a chance to watch any porn.
We've talked a lot about your work in erotic filmmaking, but you've actually also made a documentary about craft and making it homemade, which I just thought was so fun. And you spoke about, generations of women reclaiming craft for themselves rather than being told to do it. Could you tell me a bit about making it handmade?
Making it handmade came out, because this is my other love. Sex and craft are one of my two main interests. So, and I've always done craft, and I remember around that time I started finding all these people doing really unusual things. Like, there was a woman in the States doing, I think I found her because she was doing pornographic cross stitch, and then it sort of started from there. And I think I found it really interesting that there were all these online communities happening of craft, and there were women taking craft and subverting it in some sort of way, whereas traditionally skill sharing was passed down from your grandmother to your mother to you sort of thing. But that sort of has gone now, because I think probably a lot of my generation, a lot of our mothers were feminists, and they saw doing craft as subjugating women, so they didn't do it. So that a lot of those skills were sort of lost. So suddenly found things like YouTube tutorials, and I want to put in invisible zip, how do I do this? It's like you can find all those things online. So I thought it was really interesting that these online communities were skill sharing. But then there were also the beginning of all these crafternoons or craft groups starting up that were doing something a little bit unusual and different. And it wasn't so much about traditionally, which is about making sure your technique's perfect and it doesn't look like it's homemade. It was about just giving it a go and getting in there and doing it. So yeah, that's sort of where I suppose that idea came from. And
I really love craft, and I didn't get taught by my parents or my mother. It was completely just friends who liked knitting who would show you, or YouTube was huge. I love the idea, and I can't wait to watch it because I haven't had a chance yet, but I find it really, really interesting, because it's true. We, craft afternoons, you just get together and throw things together, and if you're terrible, it's just funny. You just move on. It's not like a symbol of your femininity or...
And I think that's an interesting thing. Like, I still craft, and people go, oh, wow, did you knit that? Yeah, they'll go, oh, I love your jumper or something. I go, yes, I knitted. And they go, oh, wow, I tried knitting, but I kept on making mistakes. And I said, well, that doesn't matter. That's just the fun of it. Yeah. And, I think a lot of people sort of start crafting and then they stop because, they make a mistake and they just think, oh, it's ruined now. And it's like, well, no, that's just the joy of, I've got a scarf here. I'm sure if you looked at that, you'd find mistakes in it. But that's the thing that just makes it individualistic and makes it something you crafted.
Our final question is always, is there a woman that particularly inspires you in that work that we should look into?
I draw my sort of inspiration from so many different places. I mean, a lot of filmmakers, I think, well, Candida Royale was obviously one. She's since passed away, but she was a big inspiration and a big support, and I really found what she did was fascinating. I seem to like a lot of French filmmakers for some reason, like Claire Denis, and Catherine Briard are two filmmakers whose work I really love and really admire, and I think they've done some very interesting work. It's probably it off the top of my head.
That's pretty good. Thank you so much for coming and chatting to me about all this. It's been so fascinating.
No problems. Thank you very much for having me.